Welcome back to 215. My name is Steven. I'm really excited to get started on this again. Today, we'll actually be taking a look at John chapter 6. This is the 7th video in our series on the Gospel of John. So if you haven't seen any of the previous videos, I highly recommend that you go check those out first and then come back and we'll take a look at this together. So as I mentioned, John chapter 6 is where we find ourselves today. And John chapter 6 is full of the road markers of the Gospel of John. In this study in particular today, we'll be examining the 4th and 5th of 7 signs that are included in the Gospel of John. And these include the feeding of the 5,000, which really sets much of the context for the entire chapter, and it serves as a sort of physical illustration for Jesus's teaching that proceeds hereafter. And we'll also be examining as Jesus walks on water, and it's there to sort of demonstrate Jesus's power over creation itself and even many other things. So without further ado, let's get started on this. All right, so today we'll be taking a look, John chapter 6. Let's begin in verse 1. After these things, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, or Tiberias. A large crowd followed him because they saw the signs which he was performing on those who were sick. Then Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. So the Passover celebration, it held multiple significant facets for the Jews. We focused previously on the Passover lamb and its parallels with Jesus. However, the Passover was also significant as it celebrated the exodus of the Israelites out of Egypt and God's providing for them in the wilderness. So part of this provision, it included manna, or bread from heaven, that God gave the Israelites to sustain them along their journey. So to help gain a little bit of context and a little bit of idea as to sort of the bigger picture, we'll actually take a look at John chapter 16 today. This is at Exodus chapter 16, and this is a little bit of a longer passage, but I think it's important for the context. Then they set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the sons of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after their departure from the land of Egypt. The whole congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The sons of Israel said to them, Would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether or not they will walk in my instruction. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. So Moses and Aaron said to all the sons of Israel, At evening you will know that the Lord has brought you out of the land of Egypt, and in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, for he hears your grumblings against the Lord. And what are we that you grumble against us? Moses said, This will happen when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening, and bread to the full in the morning. For the Lord hears your grumblings which you grumble against him. And what are we? Your grumblings are not against us, but against the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, Say to all the congregation of the sons of Israel, Come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumblings. It came about as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the sons of Israel that they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, I have heard the grumblings of the sons of Israel. Speak to them, saying, At twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So it came about at evening that the quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew evaporated, behold, on the surface of the wilderness there was a fine flake-like thing, fine as the frost on the ground. When the sons of Israel saw it, they said to one another, What is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, It is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. So, Jesus, no doubt, having all of this in mind, this sort of idea of the manna, he begins to set up this next sign, and that ties him to the Old Testament scriptures. Verse 5. Therefore, Jesus, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming to him, said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these may eat?" This he was saying to test him, for he himself knew what he was intending to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, for everyone to receive a little. So, interestingly enough, this particular miracle, aside from the resurrection of Jesus, is the only miracle that's described in all four of the gospel accounts. In the Gospel of Mark, it's indicated that the people were not simply following Jesus, but rather they were being taught by him as well. Mark chapter 6, verse 34, it actually says a little bit more, and it expounds some on this as well. So we'll check that out, Mark chapter 6. When Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. So his having taught the people all day most likely contributed to this, to his concern for feeding them. Jesus, though, here he asks Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these may eat?" Philip had already witnessed Jesus' miracles on multiple occasions, and he should have been fully aware that Jesus possessed the power to accommodate their needs. Philip's response, though, it showed where his mentality truly lied. He was correct in his observation that 200 denarii wouldn't have been enough to buy enough bread for all of these people. It was approximately 6 months' wages, which in fact, it just wouldn't have been enough. And for the 5,000 men who were present, and this doesn't even include the women and children, but even if they had enough money, where could they possibly have acquired that much bread? It would have been a tremendous amount. However, rather than believing that Jesus could have simply provided food for the people as God did for all of Israel during the Exodus, or transformed something into bread just as he turned the water into wine, Philip's concern was primarily focused on providing through financial means. On the other hand, Philip's intent seems to be good here in this case. He didn't refuse to spend the money if he had it in order to provide for the people. He simply was focused on his lack of resources rather than the abundance of Jesus' power. Verse 8. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are these for so many people?" So the specific resources that are being mentioned here, they actually hold a really interesting significance. One of the miracles of Elijah involves the multiplying of 20 barley loaves to feed 100 men. And we can actually check that out in 2 Kings. This is chapter 4, verse 42. Now a man came from Baal-Shalisha and brought the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in his sack. And he said, "Give them to the people that they may eat." His attendant said, "What, will I set this before 100 men?" But he said, "Give them to the people that they may eat. For thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left over." So he set it before them, and they ate and had some left over, according to the word of the Lord. So this miracle, it's sort of an interesting parallel, and there's sort of an interesting significance that's here. By Jesus performing an even greater miracle with even less physical resources to start with, in a way, he is about to set himself above even Elijah, who is considered to be one of the greatest prophets in Israel's history. This would also contribute to the people declaring him to be the prophet who is come into the world later in verse 14. Verse 10. Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number of about 5,000. So like I mentioned a little bit ago, it's an interesting side note that the number that's included here of 5,000, it's specifically referring to men only. And considering the possibility of women and children being present as well, there easily could have been potentially thousands of people in the area. And to give a modern example of this, if you want a modern visualization, 5,000 people would fill a medium-sized concert venue. So there's quite a few people here. Verse 11, Jesus then took the loaves, and having given thanks, he distributed to those who were seated, likewise also of the fish as much as they wanted. When they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments so that nothing will be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. Therefore, when the people saw the sign which he had performed, they said, "This is truly the prophet who has come into the world." So in a certain way, Jesus not only was giving thanks for the miracle that was about to take place, but also for the rations that they had here as well. While the quantity that was given was meager, it was all that the giver had to give, and it at least seems to have been given without the expectation of receiving an abundance in return. Furthermore, we see that the boy isn't named by name, nor is he mentioned again. He gave what he had without expectation of fame or notoriety. Jesus used this offering to glorify the Father. And in this way, we see that when we offer all of ourselves, our resources, time, energy, talent for the Lord's use, he can take the meager offering that we have and multiply it for his use and for his glory. He doesn't require us to first have much to offer him, but rather he calls us to offer all that we have and all that we are without holding back, no matter how insignificant that offering may seem to us. So if you're feeling insignificant, it's a good idea to remember that all this boy had to offer Jesus was a fish sandwich. But the boy here who offered the resources, undoubtedly he wasn't left out of the blessing either. His offering was meager, but because of Jesus, he ended up with more than what he began with. You see, so often in our service in the building of God's kingdom, we're blessed as well when we serve and give of ourselves, not necessarily in financial or in physical ways, but so often we are blessed spiritually by simply being given the opportunity to grow and to go deeper in our relationship with the Lord and to see him working and moving. It's a blessing in and of itself. We also see that there was no need to ration or to divide the available food evenly. Those who were present were able to have as much as they wanted, as it says in the text. Jesus' provision for the people, it was clearly more than sufficient to meet their needs. He wasn't stingy about this blessing. And with the parallels and the symbolism that are drawn later in the text of chapter 6, this brings to mind the idea that Jesus' sacrifice for us, his serving as the bread of life, it was truly sufficient to meet our needs. He didn't skimp or cut corners in his role as the Messiah, but rather he fulfilled it in its totality. So we see here that the text sort of begins to shift gear and it moves quickly from this feeding of the 5,000 to Jesus walking on the water. And this is the fifth of 7 signs that are included in the Gospel of John, as I mentioned previously. This miracle is also mentioned in Matthew and Mark as well. And the 3 accounts combined together, they can help paint a larger picture of the event as different details are mentioned in each of the accounts. So we'll be kind of drawing from a little bit from each of them to kind of get a good idea of this larger picture. But we'll actually be picking it up here in verse 15. So Jesus, perceiving that they were intending to come and take him by force to make him king, withdrew again to the mountain by himself alone. Now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, and after getting into a boat, they started to cross the sea to Capernaum. It had already become dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. So here in this particular text, we see that while the Jews were ready to crown Jesus as their new king, with their intent being to use him to overthrow the Roman government and liberate Israel, this was not Jesus's goal or his intent. Jesus' immediate response in light of their cheering and their accolades, the prospect of political power, was not to seize it, but rather to withdraw from it. And when we compare this particular account with that of like Matthew 14:23 and Mark 6:46, we see that Jesus' intention, as much as it often was when he would withdraw by himself to pray, would be to pray to the Father. Jesus' goal, according to the Father's will, was far more important than any sort of political struggle. Rather than merely liberating Israel from the shackles of the Romans, Jesus' goal was the liberation of mankind from the shackles of sin. Mark 6:45, it also includes an interesting detail where it says that Jesus compelled the disciples to go ahead of him. Knowing much of the mentality of the disciples, it's not too far-fetched to believe that they were being caught up in the frenzy as well, preparing to crown Jesus king by force. And on the other hand, it's also possible that Jesus was simply sending them ahead for their safety from the crowd. While the text doesn't say, in either case, the impending storm on the Sea of Galilee would soon prove to test the faith of the disciples. Verse 18. The sea began to be stirred up because a strong wind was blowing. Then when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near to the boat, and they were frightened. So obviously the disciples here were in a bind. They were 3 to 4 miles out. They were in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. Jesus wasn't even physically present with them. And to top it all off, there's a dangerous storm that was raging around them, making it difficult to paddle, while undoubtedly also exhausting them, which would only serve to increase the danger even further. And they find themselves here all because of their obedience to Jesus' command for them to go ahead of him. The reality is that obedience to the Lord in no way guarantees or even offers an easier path. And in many ways, living obediently sometimes places us on a more difficult path than the alternative would have been. Often it will bring us persecution, or it'll make us the odd man out, and it will set us in a certain circumstance where we have to lean on the Lord even more. And yet it's in these very circumstances that we see some of the greatest opportunities for spiritual growth and a deepening of our faith as we trust in the Lord to meet our needs. Interestingly enough, this actually isn't the first instance of the disciples being caught in a storm on the Sea of Galilee. We can actually take a look at the other one. This would be in Matthew chapter 8. It says, when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being covered with the waves. But Jesus himself was asleep. And they came to him and woke him, saying, "Save us, Lord, we are perishing." He said to them, "Why are you afraid, you men of little faith?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and it became perfectly calm. The men were amazed and said, "What kind of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" So in many ways, one could suppose that Jesus here, he was testing the disciples as to the state of their faith since the previous storm. Even within the pages of the Gospel of John, we've already seen examples of Jesus' power transcending space and distance through the healing of the nobleman's son. Jesus' absence during the incident that's mentioned here, it served to reveal a way in which the disciples' faith needed to be placed in Jesus' care, even when he wasn't physically present with them. Nevertheless, Jesus was walking on the water. This holds a few different meanings, both literally and symbolically, when we look at historical context and some of the many different angles of it. Jesus is walking on the water. It undoubtedly demonstrates for the disciples once again that he was master over creation, the elements, and even the laws of physics. And it's really no wonder that he was able to prove his mastery over these things, as they were created through him, as we've previously mentioned in John chapter 1, verse 3, where it says, "All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being." This miracle, it also sets him apart from the pagan gods and the legends of that day. In much of ancient thought, the waters and the seas were commonly associated with ideas of chaos and disorder. And yet Jesus here, in the midst of the chaos and the storms, he walks on the water. And toward the end of the miracle, he even calms the storm itself. He brings order in the midst of all the chaos. Roman and Greek mythology, just as another point, Roman and Greek mythology, they held their own belief in gods of the sea, such as Neptune and Poseidon, respectively. They were often depicted as subduing and commanding raging waters through feats of great strength. And yet Jesus displays his power over the elements by simply walking on the water and calming the storm by merely his presence. And in a certain way, it also ties Jesus to the Old Testament imagery as well. During Israel's exodus out of Egypt, God, through Moses, famously split the Red Sea in order to allow the Israelites a dry passage on which to escape the Egyptian forces that were chasing them. And yet Jesus takes even this a step further, walking on the water itself, and in a certain way, even proving his greatness over Moses. The disciples, however, seeing Jesus walking on the water, it says here in the text that they were frightened. And within the parallel accounts in Mark chapter 6, 49 through 50, we see that it is mentioned that the reason behind this disciples' fear was not directly because of the storm itself. And in fact, just one verse prior to that, Mark mentions that the disciples were straining at the oars, which seems to express more frustration than fear. It's important to keep in mind that many of the disciples were fishermen from that region, and no doubt they would have been caught in multiple other storms prior to this and before their time with Jesus. Rather, instead, as it says in the previously mentioned account in Mark, they were afraid because they believed Jesus to be a ghost. And here we see another instance in which superstitions of the day may have served as a barrier to belief. Some Jewish traditions at the time taught that demons and spirits wandered the sea. The disciples, especially being of seafaring culture, would have been familiar with such a thought. And as a result, they respond in fear rather than faith, believing more strongly upon these superstitions than they do upon Jesus. Verse 20. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." So they were willing to receive him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at land to which they were going. Jesus here, he says, "It is I, do not be afraid." He didn't offer a reassurance of everything will be all right, nor did he issue a promise that he would calm the storm, though he does happen to, as this does happen, as we'll see shortly. But rather, it was simply enough for the disciples to know that it was Jesus and that he was present with them. In Matthew's account, we actually see a further interaction also take place between Jesus and Peter, being that Peter briefly walks on water as well with Jesus. And we can actually take a look at this in Matthew chapter 14. Peter said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." And Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But seeing the wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him and said to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind stopped, and those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "You are certainly God's Son." So coming back here into John. So here in Matthew, Peter uses this phrase, "Lord, if it is you." Peter's willingness to step out of the boat, even while the storm around them was still raging, it was based on knowing that the one he was speaking to was Jesus. His confidence, it wasn't in his own ability, but rather it was in Jesus's demonstrated power. And thus, when Peter became distracted by the storm surrounding him, rather than focusing on Jesus, he began to sink in his doubt. And so Peter cries out for Jesus to save him because he believed that he could. It says here back in John, it says, "Immediately the boat was at the land." This serves as another miniature miracle that's sort of grouped in with Jesus' walking on the water. Previously in verse 19, it's mentioned that the boat was 3 to 4 miles out, and with the disciples struggling to row even that far. And yet when Jesus arrived, they were immediately at land. Furthermore, in Mark chapter 6, verse 51, it's stated that as soon as Jesus stepped into the boat with them, the wind stopped, which much to the astonishment of the disciples. And here we see another example of the power of man versus the power of God. Attempting to accomplish the will of God, even trying to live in obedience on our own strength, is fruitless. It's much like paddling a boat in the midst of a great storm, straining against the oars. And yet when we yield to the Lord through that act of surrender, what once seemed impossible becomes possible. to the addict that's struggling to be clean, or to the alcoholic struggling to be sober. It may seem impossible, but with the Lord, it is possible. And to anyone struggling to live in obedience to the Lord, it may seem impossible, but with the Lord, it is possible. James chapter 4, verse 7 says, "Submit therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you." We can, through the combination of submitting to God and resisting temptation, be free from sin and walk in obedience to the Lord. So that kind of brings us to the end of this segment. We'll actually be picking up the second half of chapter 6 in the next episode. There's just so much to unpack in this idea of Jesus speaking the words, "I am the bread of life," and all of the terminology and everything that sort of surrounds that. So we'll be picking that up in the next part. But my prayer is that this has been fruitful for you and that it's been helpful. And it's my prayer that you will join us for the next one. Thanks for watching.